So they're releasing the top 25 games now, guys. And so they start off with number 25 at Tulane. They are new. Army moves up a spot to number 24. This is good for Notre Dame. You expected it because they did have their first good win of the season over North Texas this weekend, the only team with a winning record they have. So Army moves up a spot. That's now 2 G5 teams. Missouri moves up a spot to number 23. They're going to be out soon because they're going to drop a couple games before the season is over with, in my opinion. But Missouri moves up. LSU falls 7 spots to number 22.
Oh, poor babies.
Yeah, so sad. So that was and they got, I mean, because they didn't just lose, they got destroyed. South Carolina jumps in all the way up to 21. So that's a really good entrance into the top 25 from South Carolina. So 3 SEC teams in already, and they're going to announce number 20 here in a second. So Louisville is definitely moving up. I would be shocked if Louisville somehow dropped out of the top 25 after not playing this past weekend and having a win over a Georgia Tech team that beat Miami. Number 20 is Clemson, who moves up 3 spots after a really gritty, good bounce-back road win over Virginia Tech. We didn't talk about it, but that was a gritty win for Clemson after getting beat by Louisville to jump up. Louisville now is up to 19, fellas. So that's huge for Notre Dame. You now have a top 20 win, 2 top 20 wins for Notre Dame. So that's a good sign for Notre Dame. Washington State moves up 3 spots, number 18, having a quietly sneaky good season. Their only loss is to Boise State, by the way.
Are they considered Pac-12, Pac-2? What are they considered? They're considered at large?
Like Notre Dame. They can only get an at-large bid like Notre Dame. So
gotcha.
Washington State, Oregon State are treated like Notre Dame, UConn, and UMass. Number 17 is Colorado, who's up 3 spots after their, I would say, very good win at Texas Tech, who was coming off of an upset victory over Iowa State the weekend before. So nice win for Colorado. Trailing early and then ended up rolling by 2 touchdowns. Really nice win for Colorado, in my opinion, to show some adversity. They've been kind of leading and just kind of whooping teams recently. That falling behind a Texas Tech team that's already pulled off a couple upsets was good. K-State up 3 spots to number 16 at 7-2. So you're seeing the Pac-12 make their presence felt now here. Iowa State clearly out. We're at 16 now. They were not that high last week. They're clearly out after losing the second straight game. They got smacked a little bit this weekend. So by Kansas, who's not that good this year. So
Kansas is going to be a disruptor, baby. You watch. They got to play Colorado, and they got another big game too. I can't remember.
A&M falls a spot to 15, so that means Ole Miss leaped them, which is not a surprise after the Ole Miss beatdown of Georgia this weekend. But A&M falls to 15 during their bye week, and A&M will have plenty of chances to move up with the Texas game coming up. But that's not overly surprising. So that's the top 15. You have two Notre Dame opponents already on there, Vince. And a third Notre Dame opponent, or a upcoming Notre Dame opponent, is on there at number 20, at number 24. So initial thoughts so far, guys, of the top 25. Trev, start with you.
Yeah, I mean, so far I think the committee's doing a really good job of getting it right. I saw they just put up number 13.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. Number 14 is SMU. So SMU is in at number 14. I thought they were going to talk about the top 15 because they went away from the ranking. But SMU is number 14. And number 13 is Boise State, who obviously would be the highest ranked group of 5 team so far in the rankings. Number 12 is Georgia. Georgia fell all the way to 12, fellas. Wow. That is a big drop.
And they're behind Miami. That kind of surprises me a little bit.
Yes.
Wow. That surprises me.
Miami lost a competitive game to a scrappy Georgia Tech team who has some good losses. You know what I mean? So, and according to ESPN, Georgia at 12 with Boise at 13, Georgia's out of the playoff right now.
Yeah, because Boise's going to jump them at the end of into the 12 spot. Yeah,
exactly. So that is a very interesting turn of events, guys. Georgia's out, so they're getting ready to announce here the rest. Let's see what number 11. Let's see who that is. The anticipation is killing me, fellas.
Who's 12?
Georgia.
I'm sorry,
Georgia. SMU's 14.
Right.
Boise's 13. Georgia 11 is Ole Miss.
Yeah.
So Ole Miss is up to 11. So Ole Miss does not leap Notre Dame, but Ole Miss would now be the 11 seed. they're 11th ranked and 11th seed.
They're both,
which is interesting. Yep, because 12 would be Boise, who jumps from 13 to 12. They don't get knocked down by anybody. Since right now, it would appear that Miami's still going to be a top 10 team, which is going to be very interesting. I'm very curious where they're going to have Miami right now. Yeah, very well. That having Louisville up at 19 helps them though, because they at least have that win.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And the team they lost to, a 5-point game, is a quality Georgia Tech team who's lost to Notre Dame, who's lost to Louisville, who's lost to Virginia Tech, who's a scrappy team. 10 is Bama. Wow. So Alabama does not leap Notre Dame with 2 losses. So Notre Dame is going to rise up. Now the question is, are they 9 or are they 8? So Bama at 10. There's going to be a lot of action on the back end for these SEC teams, fellas. Very interesting. And I think, Trevor, this goes to the notion that Georgia win isn't as good now. That Georgia win's not a whole lot better for the A&M for Notre Dame at this point in time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
9 is Miami. So Miami and Georgia both fall behind Notre Dame.
Wow.
So Miami is the number 9 seed. So as of right now, guys, Notre Dame would be a home team in the playoff because they're going to at least be at 8, which I expect Notre Dame to kind of come in here at number 8 is my prediction.
But isn't Miami going to leap? Or SMU still has a cut.
You're right.
So
you're right.
Miami's going to be.
You're right.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You're right. Notre Dame is a number 8. So Notre Dame comes in at number 8. So that would put them as the 9 seed. You are correct, Vince. You are correct. So Notre Dame is in at number 8. So they are up 2 spots since last week. Number 7 is BYU taking a jump. Tennessee, Volunteers of Tennessee are now at 7. Apparently they were very impressed by BYU needing the officials to help them beat Utah this weekend. Apparently.
That was unbelievable. They stole that game.
A not very good Utah team.
Right.
Very, very, very interesting. And Indiana's also now going to go up.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see what they do next.
Of course, IU's going to go up because they're going to play Ohio State. They want that to be a top 5, top 6 matchup.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Number 6 is BYU. So that is I'm actually where was Indiana was ahead of BYU last week. But my thing is, Vince, last week Tennessee was ahead of BYU and Indiana. That's the reason I'm talking about Indiana going up is because of that. I think you could be right that it's like, hey, let's give Ohio State an even better win. But right now,
or IU a good win.
True. Well, they were already going to be a good win. But Tennessee got leaped by BYU and Indiana despite having a convincing victory this weekend. That's the weird thing about it is Tennessee had a good win this weekend. They beat Mississippi State by 19 in a game that they were clearly, in control of the whole game. So how does BYU barely beating Utah, who stinks this year, impress them and make them all of a sudden a better team in the eyes of the committee? I don't understand that one, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I don't know. SMU didn't play this weekend, so it doesn't improve their strength of schedule. Kansas State didn't play this weekend, so that doesn't improve their strengths. I don't get that one. Indiana's a 5. So so now your top 4, you're gonna have Penn State in the top 4. I'm about to lose it, guys. You're about to have a team with 0 top 25 wins in the top 4.
How is Penn State above IU at this point? They're undefeated Big Ten team.
They got a better loss. Penn State has no losses. I mean, Indiana has no losses. So how do you have Penn State in the Big Ten with 1 loss, who's squeaked by a lot of games, and Indiana's in that same league with no losses, and they've dominated everybody they've played except for Michigan, who Penn State also hasn't played this year. I just do not understand that. Somebody at Penn State has some pictures that are bribing somebody in the committee. I'm just telling you that right now, man. I just don't understand the Penn State love. They're going to be 4. It's going to be Penn State, Texas, Ohio State, and Oregon is how this is going to fill out. Yeah, 4 of the top 5 teams are Big Ten teams. Are you kidding me? Come on, guys. We're having a little bit too much of a love fit. Oh, gee, a Big Ten guy's at the top of the committee. Interesting how that plays out that way. Interesting. Penn State's 4. You know what, though? Unbelievable, man.
And that bumps
unbelievable.
That bumps them to the 11. They're going to play the 11 seed, right? They're the 6.
No, they're the 5. They would be the 5 seed, yeah.
They're the 5, yeah.
They would actually, no, Penn State's 6. They would play Ole Miss. Ole Miss would smack them. Texas is 3, which we expected. And then we'll see Ohio State and Ohio State will be 2, Oregon will be 1. So, guys, just overall, just thoughts of, I mean, because we know what 2 and 1 is going to be. So just overall thoughts of just initially what you guys are seeing from the rankings so far.
Go ahead, Trev. I'm still filling stuff out over here.
Yeah, I'm kind of taking it all in as well right now. I mean, I understand based on I'll start with IU because Penn State is the one that I'm sure will be a hot topic of discussion throughout the night. I understand why IU is up to 5th based on where they were before and who lost and they haven't won and yeah, they're dominating opponents. But again, I just college football is going into week 11 and they have yet to play a team that has 6 wins. That just doesn't sit right with me that's the 5th best team in the country. It just doesn't. Like, I get that. There's no angle of it. I get it. They're dominating everybody. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, but
Trevor, I wonder what happens when they lose by multiple touchdowns to Ohio State, which I think is what's going to happen. How far are they going to drop? Like a rock.
And that's the reason, Trevor, that this stuff matters. Because if they're too high, then they won't drop as far as they should, maybe, right? I mean, is that kind of where you're coming from?
Yeah, it is. Because here's the frustrating thing. On paper, that's what should have happened to Penn State. But at the very least, I could see some argument where they're like, well, Penn State beat Illinois when Illinois was ranked. They aren't anymore. But IU has yet to play a team that has been ranked at all ever, like at
Not
any point
500.
in the season.
And if you're going to say that about them, then you better count Navy as a win for Notre Dame. I don't want to. You better count that as Notre Dame's 3rd win over a top 25 team, 100%.
Yeah, me personally, I do. Like when I look at it, I look at it through the lens of if I talk about like the matchup itself, I talk about who Notre Dame or who that team played at that time. Right.
It needs to be both. It needs to be to me. I mean, it needs to be both. Yeah.
Yeah, especially when it's more than 2 weeks into the season. Right. Because like I do think it's a little different when they say Texas went into number 10 Michigan and beat Michigan, because now we see what Michigan is. So it's not always like a fine line, but that's my one argument against IU. It's like, yes, they are the better team than a bunch of 5-win teams. And now that you're putting them up at 5th, they lose their only ranked game of the season. And that might put them down to, I mean, do they move down to 8th and then Notre Dame moves down a spot to 9th? And Notre Dame has
here's the thing, Trev. I mean, look what they did to Miami. Miami fell 5 spots and lost to an unranked team. How far are they going to drop Indiana if they lose to the number 2 team?
Sure.
Right, like that's exactly what you're talking about. Like that's the problem with this whole process is what's your justification for jumping Indiana and BYU over Tennessee after this past weekend? Like, not that I'm not even saying that that's a wrong ranking. I'm asking why now? What happened now that they went on the road and barely beat, with officials' help, a Utah team who now I believe has a losing record? Like, what changed between what you saw last week when they, and this week with BYU? I don't understand that one. Utah right now is 4-5, guys. They're 1-5 in the Big 12. They're one of the worst teams in the Big 12, and you needed officials' help to beat them in the final seconds. How does that equate? Let's move them ahead of Tennessee, who beat Bama. You know what I mean? I don't get that. I don't get that at all.
Yeah. The Tennessee one, I don't understand why they moved down like now, especially like the timing of it is weird. I think we can all agree there's not going to be a whole lot of discussion about the top 3. I think that's just
right. No, I'm fine with the top 3. I mean,
same.
Although, again, I mean, with Texas, my only beef there is they haven't beat anybody either. They don't have any wins over ranked teams. Like, to me, there's a huge gap between 1 and 2 and everybody else based on resume. Not saying like those 2 teams would beat everybody else. That's not my point. But just resume wise, there is a gap between them. But here's my thing. You've got 2 Big Ten teams in the top 5 who have a combined 0 wins over top 25 teams. 0. Actually, let me just look at this real quick. It might actually be worse than that. Give me a second. Here's a beef that I have. Actually, I'm gonna alter this. Yes, you have, because at least Ohio State beat Penn State. Until they beat Penn State, they had no wins over ranked teams either. Your number 4 and 5 teams are Big Ten teams that are combined 17-1 with a grand total of 0 top 25 wins. The best win of all of them was a 21-7 win over a 6-3 Illinois team, who, by the way, barely beat Purdue. Ohio State beat Purdue 45-0. Oregon beat them 35-0. Notre Dame beat them 66-7. And the team that is currently the best win for Penn State beat them by a point. That good win for Penn State, it also, by the way, just lost to Minnesota this past weekend, guys. So I'm actually incorrect. Illinois is not 6 and yes, they are 6-3. They lost to Minnesota 2 weeks ago. So I just don't understand how you can justify having those two teams there, especially Penn State, or especially Tennessee and Penn State. You could argue Indiana, hey, at least Indiana's undefeated, right? Trevor, like, okay, they haven't played, but at least they were undefeated.
Right.
How do you have Penn State? Is it really is Penn State, are you evaluating losses that greatly? That the fact that they have a better loss than Tennessee trumps the fact that Tennessee has at least 2 wins better than anything that Penn State has done? Bama versus Illinois is greater from a quality win standpoint than Ohio State and Arkansas are from a better loss standpoint. Am I wrong? I'd take Arkansas over Illinois right now. I just that, and the problem is Penn State's schedule is so soft. There's no one else on their schedule that's going to expose them. That's the problem. You know what I mean? They're gonna be a top 5 team in the college football playoff with no wins over a ranked team. None. How does that make sense?
Yeah,
how does that make sense?
I said this last week, and Bryan, I know I've talked to you a lot about this. Vince, I think you and I talked about it after the post game on Saturday. I want to talk to somebody from the Penn State lens. I really do. Because like I've said, like every supporter, every person who claims to break down that specific team that they follow, whatever the Irish breakdown equivalent is for Penn State, I want to know what the justification is, right? Like I wonder if there's just
Make your case, right?
100%. Like what is it? Because from the other side of the table, it's you've gotten this far because the most impressive thing on your resume is a loss. It is like that. That's what's keeping Penn State here. Like, I think it'd be an interesting world to see in a world where, let's say, IU does beat Ohio State. What happens to Penn State then? Because the one thing that's clinging them to this high of a ranking is their loss to the number 2 team in the country. So what happens if that number 2 team in the country picks up their second loss? Now, granted, their 2 losses would be to the number 1 and the number 5 team in the country. So I guess we could kind of cross that bridge when we get there. But I want to know what it is about Penn State, short of the photo debacle that you brought up at the beginning of the show, which very well might be a case. But I want to know what it is. I want to know if there's just something that I'm not seeing or something that I'm not understanding. This one misses me. I don't understand Penn State being the 4th best team in the country. And there's no argument you could make. You know, I know the playoff committee has also taken into consideration the eye test, which I'm a firm believer that the eye test can only get you so far. But you can't even say
Trevor, they failed that. They failed that.
Saying. Right.
I mean, Penn State doesn't even pass the eye test. They beat Bowling Green by a touchdown. They beat Illinois by 2 touchdowns. They beat UCLA by 16. They beat USC, who has a losing record, by 13. They beat a 5-4 Wisconsin team who got murdered by Iowa the next week by 15. They lost to Ohio State, and then they had the best win they've had this year so far, impressively, is a 29-point win over a Washington team that's now 5-5. I mean,
that's what I'm saying.
They really killed Kent State. I mean, literally, Penn State and Tennessee have a common opponent. They both played Kent State, and Penn State beat them 56-0. And Penn State had Let's see. Penn State's offense had 718 yards of offense, 8.9 yards per play. Great. Tennessee scored 71 points and had 740 yards against them and 9.3 yards per play. You know what I mean? And it's just I don't understand how you can compare Penn State to any of the teams in the top 10 and say they deserve to be over that team. What's Penn State's record right now if they have Alabama's schedule, Notre Dame's schedule, Georgia's schedule? I mean, literally pick a team outside of Indiana and tell me they have they have a better record than any of the teams in there right now.
Sure.
I mean, ridiculous.
I mean, that's what's frustrating because there's no aspect that you can look at Penn State's resume. Or any aspect that you can look at their ranking and justify it, which is why I said I want to know what the case is. It's not the eye test. It's not their resume. You can't even look in some world. I can understand. You can kind of say, well, IU beat UCLA really bad, so now they can compete with Bama, I guess. But with Penn State, I don't even see the argument.
Trevor, there's no world in which Penn State should be ahead of Indiana right now. They're in the same conference. They play some of the similar teams.
Yep.
Well, Indiana, they have a better loss. Indiana hasn't played Ohio State.
And they haven't lost.
I don't want this whole show to turn into an anti-Penn State. We talked a lot about that. We'll talk more about that. I want to get some of your guys' thoughts on the rest of the rankings a little bit. Let's jump into the bottom, Vince. 20-25, Clemson, South Carolina going up, LSU falling way down, and obviously Army being in there. Tulane being there at number 5, guys, is very interesting from a Notre Dame standpoint. Navy has to play Tulane here real soon. I believe it's actually this weekend. Navy plays Tulane, who's now a top 25 team.
That would be now. Navy, they can get that win.
Does Navy have a shot to jump back in? Well, Tulane's in at 8-2, right? They have no big wins. They just got some good losses. If Navy then beats Tulane, they will have also beaten 2-loss Memphis, and one of their losses was to Notre Dame. Is there a shot that Navy jumps back into the top 25 if they beat Tulane this weekend? Because
the problem is Army's probably going to fall out if Notre Dame beats them.
Possibly.
So if Navy could just flip spots,
right?
You know what I mean? And then you still got 3 ranked wins, which is more than a lot of the teams that are hovering around Notre Dame right now. And I think that would be massive if that could actually happen. And so not only do I think Navy needs to win, but I also think they need to win, not handily, but control that game. You know what I mean? And like, hey, this is the 25th team, to the 25th ranked team in the country, and they did that to them. The other piece of the 20-25 or 21-25, whatever we're looking at here, I was hoping Army would be a little bit higher because the AP has them at like 18, I think, right now. And I was hoping that they would get a little bit higher, but
I agree. But I also think the committee's closer to having Army right. If I take out Notre Dame, what's good for Notre Dame? The reality is the best win that Army has is over a 5-4 team. That's an in and not. I mean, that's the thing is they don't have that kind of win. The only reason they rank that high in the AP and coaches is because they're undefeated. And that was the same reason Liberty ranked where they did in the rankings last year. And we saw with the committee how the committee viewed Liberty last year, which was not favorably. And so that to me that is I'm actually good. I thought maybe they would jump up like above me, but maybe LSU falls behind them. But LSU's got to win over Ole Miss. Right. Like, what would Army's record be if they had LSU schedule, right? Like, so I'm okay 100%. With Army being at 24. I was surprised they were even in last week because their combined opponent schedule record was 17-41.
Yeah.
Now they got a good win over North Texas, and their defense showed themselves to be pretty good. But I'm glad that they're in. But to your point, Vince,
but they're analyzing resumes for Army, but they're not analyzing resumes for Penn State or IU.
Correct, exactly.
All they're noticing there is what conference they play in.
But I think if Navy can beat Penn State, or if Navy can beat, I wish if Navy can beat Tulane, I do wonder if next week are they both in for at least a week? Because remember, Army's off this week. Army doesn't play this weekend, so they're not going to lose.
Right.
And I don't know anybody outside the top 25 that's going to have any kind of good enough win to jump ahead of them in the top 25. So, but Clemson obviously going up a little bit that helps Georgia's resume. to be honest with you. Louisville moving up to number 19. So let's go 19 to 20. This is the Big 12. This is the Big 12 bracket version of the bracket. You have Louisville at 19, Washington State at 18, and then Colorado, and then Kansas State coming in next. Obviously, Iowa State get knocked out, hurt them. They're now down to 3 teams in the league, and then Texas A&M at 15. Not surprised that A&M's at 15. I expected that with Ole Miss jumping them. They had A&M ahead of LSU, unlike the voters who last week, for some ungodly reason, put LSU ahead of Texas A&M a week after A&M beat them by 15. Yeah. 15 is good. So you look at it right there, guys, in that next version of the bracket, 15 to 19, you have 2 teams that Notre Dame beat, one on the road, one at home. That gives Notre Dame's resume a major boost, because I think both of them can probably sustain a loss and have a chance to stay in the rest of the way, especially if A&M's loss is not an upset, meaning their loss doesn't come until a couple weeks from now or 3 weeks from now if they happen to lose to Texas at home. A&M plays New Mexico State this weekend. They're not losing that game. I'd be shocked if they lose at Auburn and then they got Texas. So by the time they play Texas, they're going to be creeping up on they could be creeping up on the top 10 again, which only helps Notre Dame standing. And if they lose to Texas, then they're still going to be in the teens, which again boosts Notre Dame's resume a little bit, guys. And then Louisville plays at Stanford this weekend. Then they're home against Pitt. So even if they lose at Kentucky into the season, they're going to rise enough over the next 2 weeks, as long as they don't get upset, to still be a top 25 team, even if they lose to Kentucky at the end of the year. So I think this latest batch of rankings certainly helps Notre Dame's cause. That's for sure. And it helps BYU a little bit, seeing Colorado and K-State both go up 3 spots, because they're going to get one of those 2 teams in the Big 12 championship game, which is going to help them. And BYU being ahead of Notre Dame, I got no problem with. They got 2 top 25 wins. No problem with that. It's more the process. BYU deserves to be ranked ahead of Notre Dame right now. They've played Northern Illinois caliber teams and beat them. They've got 2 top 25 wins, including a win over number 14 SMU and number 17 K-State by 29. It's just what changed this week that makes them leap Tennessee. That's my only. They should have been ahead of Tennessee last week. That's my only beef with that. But them being ahead of Notre Dame is irrelevant, because they're going to be ahead of Notre Dame. And even if BYU, let's just say the committee was like, that was an ugly win over Utah, we're going to drop you below Notre Dame who's killing it. Doesn't matter. They're going to go ahead of Notre Dame anyway.
Because they're going to be a top 4 seeding.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Same with Miami. Miami being ahead of Notre Dame, behind Notre Dame, means nothing for Notre Dame, because they're still going to leap Notre Dame.
Right.
Because Notre Dame can't be in that top 4. So,
yep.
But Notre Dame moving up to 8. I mean, Trev, you and I were worried. We talked about this. You thought Notre Dame wasn't going to move at all. I thought they were only going to go up 1 spot, because I was worried that they'd pass Miami and Georgia, but Bama would leap them. And we saw that didn't. Not only did that not happen, there's now a team between Notre Dame and Alabama.
Yeah.
Whereas last week, Alabama was right on Notre Dame's heels. This week, Notre Dame moved up 2 spots, and Bama only moved up 1 with that win over Georgia.
I really thought
I wonder
Alabama.
How much Georgia Tech beating Miami is what helped Notre Dame with that.
Yeah. I actually was nervous that Alabama and Ole Miss would be ranked above Notre Dame, to be perfectly honest with you. I really was.
The only reason I wasn't worried about Ole Miss is because they got a really bad loss on their schedule.
Okay.
They've lost to 3-6 Kentucky. That's the only reason I didn't think they'd. But, Vince, to your point, I thought they were going to get close enough to where if they keep winning, then they could leap. That would have been my concern on that one. Trevor's fear was that Georgia stayed ahead of them, Bama leaped them, and Miami stayed ahead of them.
Yeah.
Which would have.
I'm actually shocked they've got Georgia as the first team out.
They should be. Right? They should be. Right.
There's a lot of things that should
I'm with you.
But I'm still surprised that it actually took place. Yeah. I mean, there's stuff that the committee got right, but there's a lot that they got wrong.
We'll talk about that, Vince, because we're hammering some of the things they got wrong. I mean, I actually think they got a lot right. I think the things they got wrong, they got egregiously wrong. Is that fair to say?
Well, and here's the thing, though, and maybe I'm just the ever optimist about this whole thing, but I think that there's a decent chance. You know, you've got IU. If we're looking at it from a Notre Dame perspective and looking at it from IU's ranked too high, Penn State's ranked too high, like it would not surprise me if, Tennessee, IU both lose. There's a chance that Texas loses to Texas A&M. There's a chance that happens, right? And if any of those teams lose, they're all going behind Notre Dame, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And that just cements, obviously, Notre Dame hosting and all of those different things. And so I think this is a very favorable spot for Notre Dame at 8. I really do. I think that they got it right with Notre Dame at the moment. I'm fine with it at the moment because I know there's more games to be played. Like if the season ended now, I would have issues with them being number 8 because I think they're better than the number 8 team in the country. But I think teams ahead of them are still going to lose, and I think they're still going to fall back behind Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Tennessee plays Georgia, so there's a chance that they would – because like if Tennessee loses to Georgia, at the very least, you flip Notre Dame with either Tennessee or Georgia.
Right.
And then that puts them at home. If Indiana loses to Ohio State, I do believe Indiana would fall behind Notre Dame. I don't think they'd fall out.
I think they fall behind.
They'd fall behind Notre Dame. I mean, because Miami has a better win resume than what Indiana has right now.
Yes.
Which is why Miami was ahead of Indiana last week, because Miami has a win over number 19 Louisville. That's better than anything Indiana has.
Right.
So if they drop them 5 spots, I do think they'll drop them 5 spots. But if they drop them 5 spots, that's behind Notre Dame, and that guarantees Notre Dame a home game
that gets them into home game territory. Yeah.
Right.
I really want them out of that 8-9 game, though. I really want them out of that 8-9 game. I just that's not as comfortable to me as I want to be.
Sure.
I've
it
really
depends on who number 1 is for me.
Fair enough. I just in my head, I have the number 6 seed like circled in my head. Like that's what I want Notre Dame to end up as, and that's where I think they're going to end up. Like if I was going to, put a couple of nickels down, I would say I think Notre Dame's going to end up as a 6 seed in the playoff rankings. That's where I think they're going to end up after everything happens, after all the chaos. And I think a 6 seed is perfect because you're either going to get the Big 12 champ or the ACC champ as the 6 seed in the second round. Bring it on.
Right.
That's where I want to be if I'm a Notre Dame fan.
I could see the committee trying to slot Notre Dame into that number 3 spot if it's an ACC team. Because it's like that's truly who's the best team in the ACC right now? It's Notre Dame.
Yeah, right.
Right. So why have Notre Dame knock out another Power 5 champ? Well, we can just have them take care of the ACC champ if they're the 6. If they're the 4 seed, it's a little harder to get Notre Dame all the way up to 1 because honestly, the 5 seed, as long as there's no upsets, the 5 seed should be the loser of the Big Ten title game.
Yeah,
if Ohio State, and I believe that even if Ohio State loses again, if Ohio State beats Indiana, and as long as it's a close game, if Oregon beats Ohio State by a field goal again, like, okay, Ohio State can't beat the number 1 team. So you don't drop them to 11, you drop them to 5 and say, but here's the problem with putting Ohio State at 5, though. That means you're putting them on a collision course to play the number 1 seed in the semifinals. Whereas if you dropped them to 6, then you could avoid that number 1 team, Oregon, until the championship game, which they may not like. They may not want to have a championship game that's the 3rd time those 2 teams have played.
Right.
So it's interesting, but just based off resume, with the win over Penn State, with the win over Indiana, and your only loss being to number 1 Oregon, as long as Oregon doesn't get upset, I think that the loser of the Big Ten title game should be number 5. Like,
I don't have a problem with that as long as it's a competitive game.
Right. If Ohio State beats Oregon by 27, then Oregon might consider falling down to 6 or something like that. Same thing if Oregon beats Ohio State.
Yeah.
But even a 2-loss Ohio State team, if their only loss is 2 really close games, neither of which were played in Columbus, Columbus, I'm fine with them being 5.
Yeah.
Especially if they handle Indiana this weekend. Because like I said, Ohio State did not play well versus Penn State and still beat them. Like we talked about with Notre Dame, the mark of a good team is when you don't bring your A game and you can beat a good team away from home. That's what we talked about, like with Georgia Tech. Notre Dame didn't play that well against Georgia Tech and smashed them.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I mean, Notre Dame basically toyed with Louisville for 3 quarters. Like that's the mark of a good team. Where Ohio State tried to give Penn State that game, and Penn State was like, "No, we're still not good enough to beat you." You know what I mean? So I'm there. After that, okay, where does Notre Dame slot?
Right. That's why I'm saying 6.
Penn State thing so frustrating.
Right.
But I am curious, how does the common opponents between Notre Dame and Penn State change things? Which right now there are none, but in the next 3 weeks there will be 2. Purdue and USC. And the thing that's unique is they're playing both of those teams at the same place the game was played. Both were at Purdue. Both will be at USC.
Right.
So that's going to make it really
That's about as even as it comes, right? When you're talking about common opponents and things of that nature. So, and I do think at the end of the day, if you're trying to figure out, who's, for example, who's 6, who's 7. Okay. So if you're the committee and you've got Penn State and you've got Notre Dame, and I said this earlier, if you're comparing those resumes at the end of the year, I still think Notre Dame's resume is going to be better than Penn State's resume. And I think they get the nod at the end of the day. Yep. They got to play USC and they got to beat them by worse than Penn State did. And they still have to take care of business against a ranked Army team. And they got to take care of business against Virginia. All of those things need to happen. But if that happens, I think when you start comparing resumes with Penn State, because they don't have any quality wins left on their schedule. So you compare resumes, Notre Dame's going to have more top 25 currently ranked teams.
Way more.
Right? And they're going to have better results. I think, obviously it hasn't happened yet. I think they're going to have better results against 2 common opponents.
And Illinois still has to play Rutgers they have to play Michigan State at Rutgers at Northwestern. It's not a guarantee that Illinois is going to lose and win all the rest of their games and be 9-3.
Right.
There's a chance they could lose another game or 2. Which then what is that Penn State's resume? I mean, then what are you hanging your resume on? USC? I mean, what's your best win at that point in time? Wisconsin, who has to play Oregon and at Nebraska and Minnesota. You know what I mean? So I do hope that the committee is willing to make some of those shakeups, which we kind of saw this week, guys. I mean, by putting Indiana and BYU ahead of Tennessee. We've shown that they're willing to move a team down despite winning and winning handily, which is what they did with Tennessee. So at least there's some of that hope where if Notre Dame just, again, keeps doing what they've been doing and Penn State keeps doing what they've been doing, then Notre Dame will have 2 far more convincing wins than over common opponents, and their overall resume is just going to be stronger, in my opinion. And that loss to Ohio State becomes less impactful because you realize, well, they haven't beat anybody. You know what I mean? And so that's how I see it. But I still think it's absurd that 4 of the top 5 teams are Big Ten teams, and 2 of them don't have a win over a team with 6 wins.
That's
7 wins. Because the 6-3 game to Illinois, no ranked teams. Those 2 teams are in the top 5 with no ranked wins.
4 of the top 5 teams are all from the same conference. That's ridiculous.
2 of them deserve. Sorry. One of them deserves to be in the conversation. Penn State is a borderline top 10 team right now. The only reason I say Penn State's still top 10 is because that defense is really good. That's the only reason the Ohio State game was even competitive, is because of their defense. Like, their defense is a legit top 10 to 15 defense, in my opinion. I don't know if you guys agree with that. Their offense is mediocre.
At best.
Mediocre.
Look, the committee gave me some hope today, but because of what they did with Georgia and how far they dropped Miami. I mean, Bryan, like you said, you and I talked in the 1:00 show, and I was very concerned that they were going to keep Notre Dame at 10 and drop Georgia and Miami just not below Notre Dame, and they were going to bump Alabama in because of the SEC bias. But it's kind of crazy that the bias is now heavily swayed towards the Big Ten, which I think is interesting. But I think for all of the reasons that we just listed off, I mean, Penn State's still ranked too high based on the ranking that they have right now with the resume that they have right now, which is why I think Notre Dame realistically is probably going to be a 7. But like right now, like today, if you were to ask me, like the committee has given me a little bit more hope that they would, if it came down to who's going to get the 6th seed, Notre Dame or Penn State. I think there's more of a call. Like, I fully believe that Notre Dame should be the 6th seed over Penn State. But my fear is now it's like, well, if the committee's not going to drop Penn State now, like when will they? Like,
well, but there was no reason to drop Penn State now, though, is my opinion, is my thing. Because, like, what about Penn State this week should have caused them to drop based on where they were last week? Like we're all arguing that they should have never been there to begin with. But based on where they were, what's the reasoning for dropping them after this week? They had their most impressive win of the season, in my opinion, by beating Washington by 29.
There will be reasons to drop Penn State once they have common opponents with Notre Dame.
So that's my only thing is, Trev, that's my genuine question. Based on where they had them last week, what would be the argument to drop them a spot this week?
My argument would be the same reason they dropped Tennessee this week.
I don't know that
Like,
they dropped Tennessee as much as I think two undefeated teams got vaulted ahead of them.
But then my question is,
Possibly.
then why does the buck stop at Penn State?
Agreed.
Like, why jump Tennessee, a one-loss team, but then not Penn State,
That's a fair
a
point.
one-loss team? And
Because
Tennessee
Penn State has here's why I think it is, because they are weighing heavily who you lost to. Because Tennessee has the lost Arkansas. They're putting a ton right now into who you lost to. A ton. And that's not good, in my opinion. It's not good. So it's interesting. Vince, what are some other thoughts you have? Were you Vince, you kind of start talking about Georgia a little bit. That's a 9-spot drop, Vince.
Yeah, but they're
9-spot drop.
But they're poised to move right back in if they beat Tennessee
into the top 12. But I don't know how much they're going to go up. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
But I think
at this point, they're not going to.
If you could see Tennessee dropping out if Georgia beats them convincing.
Yes.
My point is, we'll get to that. I just want a gut reaction before we start kind of getting.
My gut reaction is I'm surprised.
Did any of us Did any of us see them dropping them all the way down to 12?
No.
Behind guys, you realize they dropped them below. They were ahead of Miami last week. Right. They dropped them below Miami as well. Not a team that lost. They didn't just drop them behind teams that won or didn't play. They dropped them behind a team that also lost this past weekend in Miami.
Yeah, no, I am shocked by that as well. And it doesn't even matter what the outcome of that game was, because normally committee doesn't care because it's Georgia. So no, I'm shocked by that. But if you're a Georgia fan, you could be upset that you got dropped as far as you did. But at this point, the SEC championship is out of your hands. Like, that's obviously, I think that's out the window. And so now you just want to get in. You just want to get in. And I think they're poised to be able to still get in. And so if you're a Georgia fan, you're like, yeah, as long as we get in, we're good. You know what I mean? Like, that's going to be their mentality. And so if they take care of business against Tennessee, they're in. And I think that they're fine with that. They're going to have complaints this week, and I get it. I'm surprised they dropped as far as they did. But now they're poised to jump right back in after a week, as long as they beat Tennessee.
What are your thoughts, Trev?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'm shocked that they dropped them that far. I truly am. But if you go based off of what we believe the requirements are that the committee looks at, Georgia's resume is now, Georgia's best win is over Texas, which, Bryan, you and I talked earlier today, wasn't even a great team win. It was a great defensive win and a great offensive win for Trevor Etienne. But
and Texas just didn't play very well.
Yeah, agreed. And, not only did you lose, you lost by 18 points to an Ole Miss team who has already lost to a 3-6, 3-7 Kentucky team already this year. And you can't even go based on the eye test, because even in some of the games that Georgia has won, like, they haven't looked good.
13-12 over a 3-6 Kentucky team, only beat a 2-7 Mississippi State. I mean, Toledo beat Mississippi State far more convincingly than what Georgia did.
Even the Florida game. The Florida game did not look like, the final score does not reflect how close that game was.
And if DJ Lagway doesn't get hurt, guys, I'm just saying, if DJ Lagway doesn't get hurt, I'm very curious how that game shakes out.
So I do agree that with a win over Tennessee, that puts Georgia right back into the mix of everything. But I don't know if it's as guaranteed as it might have been in the past, right? So it's that game's going to be real interesting.
Because two of the teams ranked ahead of them would be teams that beat them. And Bama didn't beat them convincingly because they made it closer, but Bama was in control of that game for a long time. A very long time. Vince, to your point of them getting in, I don't disagree if they beat Tennessee. And they also have a chance to beat a Georgia Tech team that now is going to be viewed a lot higher. Because let's be honest about something else, guys. If the committee really wants Georgia in the top 25, if they really do, then they're going to do something that helps Notre Dame. And what that's going to be is Georgia Tech's off this week at 6-4. If Georgia Tech beats NC State on the 21st, it's the middle of next week. If they beat them on a Thursday, that Thursday night game, don't be shocked if all of a sudden 7-4 Georgia Tech jumps into the top 25. Think about it, right? Because they're going to have 3-point loss to a good Syracuse team. They would have lost to Louisville. They would have lost to Notre Dame, lost to Georgia Tech. They didn't have their starting quarterback against Georgia Tech. They beat Miami. They beat NC State. Don't be shocked if they do that. And if they do that to help Georgia get in, that helps Notre Dame.
Yeah.
So, my point is them falling to 12 with Notre Dame at 8 makes it almost impossible for Georgia to leap Notre Dame now. That's my biggest takeaway as a Notre Dame fan, is I don't see any scenario now based on how the rankings came out of Georgia. Now, Bama's still within striking distance, perhaps Ole Miss, but I don't see any scenario in which Georgia leaps them without somebody else falling. Because to your point, Vince, was it you that said Georgia doesn't control their own destiny anymore? You said that, right, Vince?
Yeah, I said that. Yeah, I did.
Right.
Well, I mean, other
now,
than I don't think they're going to make it into the SEC championship game. There's a back door.
But no. But that's what I'm saying is they don't control their own destiny. The only way you control your own destiny is if you can win your conference championship.
Okay. Yeah.
And without needing help from other people, Tennessee, Texas, and Texas A&M are all in control of their own destinies at this point in time, because Tennessee wins out one of the other 2 one-loss teams, because those are the only 3 teams with 1 loss. Texas or Texas A&M will lose because they play each other.
They play each other, correct.
Right. So those 3 teams are the only teams that control their own destiny in the SEC. Right. Now, if Tennessee loses next week, that's what I'm saying. Georgia doesn't control their own destiny right now. They could next week, but even next week, I'd be curious what the tiebreakers are, since they have losses to Bama and Ole Miss. So I'd be curious what the tiebreakers are. I have a feeling Georgia won't. So their point is they're going to need a lot of help to get ahead of Notre Dame. And the only way that they can get ahead of Notre Dame, Vince, is if teams ahead of Notre Dame lose. At least 2 have to lose, or teams right on their heels. So my point is, I think that what happened with Georgia is good for Notre Dame, because our biggest fear today, Trevor, was that 3 SEC teams passed Notre Dame. I think that's virtually impossible now with Notre Dame at 8 and Georgia at 12, because I think they saw, okay, they're not the team that played Texas. I think the committee had convinced themselves that Georgia's this team that played Texas, and look, they're going to turn it on when it's a big game. That's what I think people convinced themselves of. And to watch them just get smacked for 4 quarters by Ole Miss, I think woke the committee up to say, hey, they're not the Georgia of old. They're still good, and they are. They have a 31-point win over Clemson, right? They do have a win over what's the other good win that Georgia has? Texas. So they are still that team that can win those big games. They're still a playoff caliber team, but they're not what we thought they were. And they shouldn't have been 3 last week. We said that. And Ole Miss proved that. So that is my Notre Dame takeaway, guys, is I don't see any scenario in which Georgia has a chance to pass Notre Dame. So in the committee, you're spot on. But relative to Notre Dame, I don't think they're a threat to Notre Dame anymore, unless Notre Dame does something to allow them back in by not playing well.
Yeah, I was about to say, I mean, barring Notre Dame losing a game that they shouldn't, or playing, I mean, even a game closer than what they shouldn't.
Or a
looking
couple.
at the Yeah. No, I mean, 2 of the teams that are behind Notre Dame in the SEC right now, Alabama and Ole Miss, they don't even have good enough wins potentially upcoming on their schedule to pass Notre Dame. I mean, Alabama finishes their season playing Mercer, Oklahoma, and Auburn, and Ole Miss finishes playing at Florida and at home against Mississippi State. So,
and if they beat Florida, Florida will have a losing record. So, to your point, Trevor, that's a great point, Trev. Notre Dame right now has the chance for the best win, arguably the 2 best wins left on the schedule. I mean, all 3 of the teams that Notre Dame plays in the next 3 weeks are better than anybody that Alabama plays for the next rest of the season. Because you said Mercer, Oklahoma, and Auburn, right?
Yep.
Virginia has a better record than all those teams. Army, clearly. And then USC doesn't have a better record than those teams, but they are way higher than the computer models, computer metric. Sagarin still has USC in the top 25 of their computer models, because they've literally led in the 4th quarter of every single game they lost this season. And USC has a better win on their resume than Penn State and Indiana, because they beat LSU, number 22 LSU.
Yep.
So
somebody brought up a very interesting comment in the chat that I do want to bring up. If Boise State loses, does that put Army in the driver's seat to be the Group of 5 representative?
I think Boise would have to lose twice or lose bad. Because if the only way that happens is if Army beats Notre Dame. Like if Army didn't have to play Notre Dame, I'd say they'd have a shot. But like, let's say, because there's 11 spots ahead of Army right now.
Right.
So let's say Boise goes out. Boise plays, I think, do they play San Jose State this weekend? Let me go look at Boise's schedule. Yeah. I think it's, San Jose State. They play San Jose State this weekend at San Jose State. So let's say they go on the road and they play a 6-3 San Jose State team and they lose by 14 points. Is that enough to drop them 11 spots to where Army can leap them when Army's off? And if it does that not get negated the next week if Notre Dame beats them convincingly? Now, the scenario where maybe that could happen, Vince, is if they get pounded and Notre Dame still beats them, but it's like a 4-quarter Notre Dame wins by a touchdown type of game. I think that's the only scenario where you could see that happening. But there's no guarantee that then that won't be Tulane if Tulane beats Navy that jumps up and passes them if Notre Dame beats Army.
True.
That's because I don't think the committee wants any part of them naming Army or Navy as the Group of 5 team, and then that team goes out and loses to the other one the week after. I think the committee will want to avoid that as best they can. So you put Army at 10-1 in the college football playoff as the 12 seed, and this is it. And then the next week they go out and lose to Navy.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how they're going to handle that, how they would handle that. But I think that's partly why Tulane is where they are.
Gotcha.
To be honest with you, they're more of the escape clause in case Boise loses. But I don't think Boise's going to lose. San Jose State's a good football team. San Jose State's the only team that I think is left on their schedule that could beat them because San Jose State can score. And that's a big thing. San Jose State scoring about 29 points a game. They've had some really good scoring moments this year. Not so much lately, but at different times of the year, they've been able to score. Boise plays San Jose State. They play Wyoming and Oregon State. If they get to but here's the thing with Boise though, guys. If Boise loses in their conference championship game, that's where it gets interesting.
Well, because they're not a conference champ anymore.
But
they're out.
I get that. But now it's, who's the next best conference champ?
Sure.
Is it Tulane? Is it Army? Is it Navy? Is it Louisiana, who's 8-1 right now in the Sun Belt? Is it UNLV? Does UNLV all of a sudden skyrocket way up if they beat Boise State and they're 11-2? Because UNLV's got 2 losses right now to Boise and then a late loss to a decent Syracuse team. That Boise State could jack this whole thing up in the final 24 hours of committee voting if they lose. Because you can't put them in as an at-large anymore. You could only put them in as an at-large at that point in time because they're not a conference champ. So that is the only way I think because like the scenario before is like Army could jump in if Boise loses a regular season game. But if Army wins the AAC, that means Tulane got beat by Navy. And that means that Boise lost to UNLV. Does UNLV go from unranked to passing Army, who lost to Notre Dame? Right? Like that's where it gets really. Do they jump Louisiana into this conversation, guys? At if they're like 12-1 in the Sun Belt? I don't think so. So if you're the committee, you are Boise, please win out. 2 reasons. 1, we don't want that chaos. And number 2, we want the best player in college football arguably in the playoff. That's the other reason.
I don't think they're going to lose. I think they're a good team.
But the UNLV game concerns me, guys, because UNLV gave them a battle, 4-quarter battle when they played a couple weeks ago. And they're, rematches. Vince, we talk about rematches are hard, dude.
Right.
Rematches
right now,
are hard.
Colorado State is going to play them in the
That's what I'm saying. That's the caveat. If Colorado State doesn't lose, then UNLV is out.
They're on the
outside. Because UNLV only has one conference loss, and Colorado State doesn't play either one of them. That's the crazy thing about the Mountain West. Colorado State got about as good of a draw as you can imagine in their rankings because they don't have to play Boise or UNLV. But that game at Fresno would be a little bit concerning to me. Fresno would concern me a little bit if I'm them. So, guys, the group of 5 thing could have some major chaos here before it's all said and done. I hope not, because then whoever, unless Notre Dame's the 5 seed, then I'm like, I don't care. We'll play Colorado State. I don't care. I don't care.
Doesn't matter.
You know what I mean? I can live with that. Give them a warm-up game before they have to go play, the Big 12 champ or the ACC champ, right? But as I said before, barring an upset, I think the loser of the Big 10 game deserves the 5 seed. And even if I didn't think they deserved it, I think they're going to get it.
Yeah. Well,
Agreed.
look, there's 4 Big 10 teams in the top 5 right now.
Right.
They obviously love the Big 10.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, they love the Big 10. And so I agree with you that I think right now that the loser is absolutely going to be the number 5 seed.
Right.
I don't see any way around that right now.
Do you think they should? Because I do. As long as it's the Big 10 title game's a close game. Let's say it's a 1 touchdown game. It's back and forth. Both teams had shots to win it. It's a good game.
You can definitely make the argument for Ohio State being the 5 with 2 losses. And I understand the argument, and I probably agree with the argument, but it's a harder conversation than if it goes the other way. You know what I mean?
If Oregon loses and their only losses is because Ohio State would have 2 losses,
and that's the thing. Now it's 2 losses to the same team,
the number 1 team.
Once on the road and once at a neutral site. So now, granted, that neutral site is about an hour away from Columbus, right? I mean,
sure,
however far,
but it's still not Columbus.
But it's still not Columbus. I get it. Yep, I totally understand because I believe they're playing that at Lucas Oil Stadium. It's usually where they play the Big Ten championship.
It really sounded like you said Lucas Oil Stadium, Vince. I was like, what? What do you? Yeah, sorry.
It's late. Everything's running together.
It's been one of those days.
Yeah, 100%. But so on paper, it shows them with 2 losses, and then you'd be looking at them being ahead of teams with 1 loss, and so there would be an argument there. But I also understand
the league title
argument.
game.
Right.
That's the thing is I don't think the committee is gonna hurt a team that loses in the conference title game unless it's a blowout.
Right.
Maybe flip them a spot, but Ohio State would have to fall from like 2 to like 6 in that scenario.
Because I was told
how the current rankings are.
I was told if both teams are in the playoff, going into the conference championship, that the loser's not going to fall back out.
It's not a given rule, but I think that's what they're going to lean towards.
Okay.
Now, the situation could be if like they're the 11 seed or the 12 seed and they get smacked.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that would be except like LSU from 2022 is not getting in with their 4th loss because they wouldn't have been in the top 12 anyway, right? I mean, that's a but in this scenario, how am I going to punish?
So
so
like a situation.
Go ahead, Vince.
I got one.
Yeah,
Miami versus SMU,
right,
in the ACC championship. Right now, SMU's 14, Miami's 9. Right. If SMU beats Miami, do they just flip spots essentially?
And we had a super chat from our guy Tyler Evans.
Yeah, look at that. There you go.
Who said who's got a new avatar, by the way. He says, let's say thank you, Tyler. But he says, let's say SMU wins the ACC. What do you do with Miami? I think part of that depends on how does Miami play these next 3 weeks. To your point, Vince. Because if Miami doesn't play well these next couple weeks, they will continue to fall. I mean, they've got a bye week this weekend. Then they play Wake Forest at home and at Syracuse. They'll smack Wake Forest. They'll score a ton of points on Wake Forest. But let's say they beat Syracuse by a touchdown late in the game. Don't be shocked if Bama laps them, if Georgia goes ahead of them with the win over Tennessee. If Ole Miss goes ahead of them, if they're blowing people out, like I could see that. You know what I mean? So I think if SMU wins the ACC, Miami's out.
I do too.
Because the problem that Miami has is they don't have the wins that some other teams have. And if you're Miami, you better hope that Louisville wins out and beats Kentucky. You better hope. Because now you could say, hey, listen, hold on a second. If you're comparing them to Ole Miss, so it comes down to who you're going to have in, 10-2 Ole Miss or 12 or 11-2 Miami. Well, hold on a second. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky. Kentucky lost to Louisville. We beat Louisville. Right? Like that's the hope that Miami would have at that point in time if they play well these next 2 weeks. That's going to be the key. But they have to play. Miami has to smack their next 2 teams.
The fun part is there's still a lot of football left.
Tons of football.
And a lot of things are going to shake out naturally. But there's also going to be some debate, which is what makes this fun in the first place.
And we have some super chats, guys. I want to get to those before we get there. We had one from earlier today about it that we didn't get to. Vince, the ones from last night, I answered. Trevor and I answered earlier today. But we did have one from earlier today from our dude Beezer 12 Washing Beard, who, by the way, I got a chance to meet. Trevor and I got a chance to meet this weekend.
Nice.
You know, I get in my head, I envision what these guys look like, and not at all what
he doesn't have like a beard and like
normal looking guy. Just like, oh, I was expecting you to like have green hair and just like be this crazy wild guy with earrings, all just normal dude. It was great meeting you too, by the way, my man. That was awesome. But he says his super chat from earlier today was, what happens if A&M beats Texas?
So I was actually looking at this when you guys were talking about what might possibly go down in the ACC.
Hit it.
The ending of the SEC is also going to be really interesting as far as who's going to be vying for a conference championship, because Texas A&M right now has 1 loss in conference. So does Tennessee. Georgia has 2. But if, there's a situation where Georgia beats Tennessee this upcoming weekend, which is definitely not out of the realm of possibility, you'll have Tennessee with 2 losses, Georgia with 2 losses, Texas with 2 losses, and then Texas A&M will have 1 loss, barring that they win out and beat Texas. So A&M would be in the conference championship, and then there'd be a bunch of 2-loss teams, especially because, like we just said, Ole Miss and Alabama also play nobody. So that fight for the second spot in the championship is going to be between, if this plays out, a 2-loss Texas, a 2-loss Georgia, a 2-loss Ole Miss, and a 2-loss Bama in conference, which is a crazy ending. So, and honestly, the situation is kind of the same right now, barring that Texas and Texas A&M both win out. Because let's say if it's the flip-flop and Texas beats A&M, then it's still that same. You have a bunch of 2-loss teams, and then the sole 1-loss team left in Texas. Now, mind you, some of this is barring that Tennessee still beats or loses to Georgia.
Georgia. Right.
Yep. But this is the ending of the SEC is going to be crazy.
So if Georgia beats Tennessee, barring no other upsets, the winner of Texas A&M is in. It's not completely out of the question for there to be a rematch of those 2 games, but it's those 2 teams, but it's unlikely because of the tiebreakers. So what I'm reading now is the first tiebreakers head-to-head among the teams, which is null and void because you'd have a bunch of mishmash. Bama beat Georgia, Georgia beat Tennessee, Ole Miss beat Georgia. It's just like it's a mismatch. There's no clear head-to-head there because that's only if there's like 2 teams. And then the second tiebreaker is record versus common opponents for all teams involved in the tie. That could get weird. If there's no clear winner there, then the third tiebreaker is record against the highest placed common opponent. So this is what it says in this article from the Athletic. So, for instance, if Texas wins out and is in first place, that would help Georgia, but only if the teams it has played have played Texas, which Alabama, Ole Miss, and Tennessee have not. So, you'd have to find there's no one team that's going to be ranked that they all 3 played. That's the problem. And then the fourth one is, which is the combined winning percentage of all conference opponents for each team, regardless of common opponents, was essentially strength of schedule. Which surprisingly doesn't help Georgia as much as people think it does, because Georgia's in-conference schedule is not as tough as people think it is, as I pointed out last week. So, guys, this is going to get, like Trevor, to your point, this could get wild.
Yeah.
Now, if A&M beats Texas, that's huge for Notre Dame because they will have beaten one of the SEC title teams.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
And at that point in time, you're rooting for Texas A&M to win because now Notre Dame's ranking skyrockets.
Yes,
at that point in time, fellas.
Oh, I mean, look, we were told we needed to be an A&M fan the rest of the year, and there's that this isn't changing anytime soon.
That's especially true now.
Yeah,
that's especially true now
because that's Notre Dame's best win, and that's not changing anytime soon either.
Right. Well, if they lose again, there's a shot that Louisville leaps them. But to your overall point stands, that would hurt Notre Dame if they lose another game.
Yeah,
it would. if they get beat convincingly anyway. So, I mean, yeah, that'd be huge for A&M and huge for Notre Dame. So, and as I've said before, Mike Elko is a really good guy, and I like it when good people have success. So I'll be rooting for that also for that reason. But, yeah, the SEC guys could get crazy. If if Tennessee beats Georgia this weekend, then, I mean, Tennessee, they don't clinch because there's still games to play, obviously. But when you look at Tennessee's schedule, there'd have to be because they only have one game left in the league, and that's at Vanderbilt. That's it. Could you imagine Vanderbilt once again shaking up the SEC by beating Tennessee? Are you serious?
On. Fighting Clark Lees,
honestly,
baby.
For Notre Dame, that's a perfect world scenario.
Yes.
That Tennessee beats Georgia, they're out. And then Vanderbilt beats Tennessee to give them a second loss. There's a scenario in which A&M could lose to Texas and still play for the SEC title. It's unlikely because I think at that point in time, Bama would probably go in at that point in time. But, dude, it could get wild. But if A&M beats Texas also, that means Notre Dame goes up even further because they'll leapfrog Texas. If Texas loses to A&M, there's no question they fall behind Notre Dame because they'll have a common opponent on a common field.
Correct. Yep.
So, yeah, that'd be huge for Notre Dame. Huge for Notre Dame.
Gonna be great. Got a
super chat from Anthony Solomon. He says ice cream. There you go. That's for my wife. Thank you very much, Anthony. I appreciate that. You know who that's going to, Vince.
Yeah, I do.
Beast in 88. Penn State with a strength of schedule of 28 versus Notre Dame at 75. How? No ranked wins. Because strength of schedule, the algorithms that people use, inflate conferences. They give extra credit based on what leagues teams are in, the assumption about certain leagues. Yeah. And as I was pointed out to tonight, talking to someone who has a computer ranking, a lot of this is still weighted towards preseason expectations. And there's some teams that Penn State beat that had considerably higher expectations than what they've turned out to be, including like West Virginia, teams like that. So that's why I say you have to be careful with looking at some of these metrics of strength of schedule and, as metrics, because the perception of Georgia's tough schedule is that, wow, look at how good teams were coming into the season. Well, some of the teams that Georgia has played and beat aren't as like we thought. Boy, that you got to play at Kentucky. That's going to be a tough game. Well, now Kentucky's 3-6. That doesn't look like as tough of a game. They had 3 really tough games, and then the rest is like not. Yeah, you know what I mean. So it's not looking like the gauntlet it was. Florida's not very good this year. So there's a lot of teams in our schedule that we thought, we're going to be tough teams. They play Texas, who's good, Ole Miss, who's good, and Alabama, who's good. Clemson doesn't look like as good of a win right now, especially if Clemson loses again. So, yeah, I looked at that earlier and I was like, that's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
What a weird thing. What is your strength of schedule? Well, based on the start of the year, this team was supposed to be better. So your strength of schedule is heavier. That's whatever.
We have a very important question here, guys, from D. Troll Hunter. For Vince. Vince, what room of the house were you bumped to? Vince is actually promoted.
Yeah, I'm actually in front of the big screen down in the basement, basically on the other side of the wall from the office, because I wanted to be able to watch the college football playoff rankings come out. So I moved myself. I didn't get bumped. I moved myself, which is, by the way, a much more precarious spot to be in my house because there's more movement afoot in this area. I can't close myself off in the office. So there were times, if you were paying attention, there were times where I was on mute and I was yelling at people.
Yeah. So, he wasn't yelling at the TV. Freaking Penn State's way too hot. It wasn't that.
No, it was
How could you have them ranked there? Yeah, it wasn't that. That'd been great though if it was.
Yeah, I know, right? Not yet. Yeah. That will. I'm saving that for December. That's right. For the potential for yelling at the TV on that one.
That's right. Our guy Joe M with a super chat. Penn State. I love this. Thank you, Joe. Penn State AD definitely has got to be the J. Edgar Hoover of CFB. He's got to have dirt on everyone in the committee.
I don't disagree.
Just Ward Emanuel.
Because it's been every year, but it's been every year. They're always ranked too high.
I know.
They play a bunch of nothing, beat up a bunch of nothing, then lose to the two. I mean, they lost a game to Michigan last year in a game in which Michigan's quarterback did not attempt a single pass in the second half of the game, and they didn't get dinged that much for losing that game. They still played in a major bowl game and shockingly got smacked by Ole Miss. I say sarcastically.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Joe. Jeremy Snell, my guy, with a super chat. Penn State and Texas are too high. Vandy and Illinois, SMH. His point about Vandy and Illinois is that's the biggest wins for those two teams.
Oh, yeah.
Texas's best win, 3-point win over a 4-loss Vanderbilt team who lost to Georgia State. And Penn State's best win is over a Illinois team who is currently 6-3, and their best win is what? Nebraska?
My favorite.
They just lost at home to Minnesota, who, by the way, lost at home to North Carolina, who's a middle-of-the-road ACC team.
Yeah.
So, yes, I agree. Penn State. Texas, what do you guys think? Like, I'd be okay if Indiana was ahead of Texas because the argument is, well, Indiana hasn't beaten anybody. Well, neither is Texas. And because with Texas, you're basically making the same argument with Texas that you're making about Penn State. The difference for Texas for me is the eye test is part of the criteria.
Yep.
And when I look at Texas, yes, they have some ugly, an ugly loss. They were in control of the Vanderbilt game a little bit more than the final score shows. But, they dominated at Michigan. They beat Colorado State, who's 6-3. They beat 52-0. They dominated Mississippi State and Oklahoma with their backup quarterback. And that's the thing is Texas won 3 games with their backup quarterback. Now, I know their backup quarterback is talented, but they still won 2 games, really. Beat Louisiana Monroe and beat Mississippi State with their backup quarterback. You know what I mean? Like that I'm giving you some love for that. You know what I mean? And Texas has also had to win games in different ways, guys. They've had to win some games where their defense had to step up and make some plays. And I think the beatdown of Florida this past weekend is giving them a little bit of love too, since Florida was like, you got to think about it. Florida's record isn't very good, but Florida had played 3 really good games in a row. They lost a heartbreaker to Tennessee at Tennessee, destroyed Kentucky, and played Georgia down to the wire. I mean, if their backup quarterback doesn't get hurt and they have to go to their third stringer, that game looks a little bit different. So then Texas goes and just absolutely destroys them. So I think there's that eye test part where Penn State has like no wins as good as that. Like not just from who you beat, but the quality of how you beat them. They have a bunch of 27-11s, 34-27 over a MAC team, 21-7 over Illinois. Like Penn State the eye test isn't even good. With Texas, at least you can look at the eye test. Now the counter is, but at least Penn State was more competitive in their loss than what Texas was. That's the counter to that. And Penn State lost to a better team than Texas lost to. So Texas is one I have a struggle with because I'm not as offended with their ranking. Maybe that's my bias towards thinking Texas is good and not thinking A&M is or Penn State is. Maybe that's it.
That's called watching
the problem
football.
After number 1 and 2, guys, is there's not a lot of good wins in that next group of teams. That's why I think BYU, if anybody has a beef to be higher, it's BYU because they actually have 2 top 20 wins. They've beat number 17 and number 14 at SMU. They beat SMU on the road.
Texas is a weird team for me. No, I agree with you, Brian. I'm kind of in the same boat because, like, Texas is that one team that I will hear arguments out for on either side. You look at the IU lens. They have one common opponent, and it's Michigan. And, yes, Michigan's not a good football team, but IU beat them by 5 points in Bloomington. Texas beat them by 19 in the Big House.
Yeah,
which is like that has to count for something, right?
Yeah.
But then at the end of the day, you kind of look at some of the other opponents that Texas has played. Like I do believe that, IU, if they played Colorado State, might, beat them what Texas did. And if they played UTSA, I could see IU, in a world beating them in that same capacity. So I think that's interesting. I think with Penn State, I think you have more of an argument for IU to be ranked ahead of Texas than you do for Penn State, in my opinion. And the difference there is the eye test, because the eye test will favor IU and Texas, but I don't think the eye test favors Penn State. Like their most impressive win right now is over 6-3 Illinois in probably the most boring football game that I've watched in 2024. So I just, I don't see that. But with IU, they do have one common opponent in Michigan. And that to me is kind of the divide.
You guys almost lost that game against Michigan. They were not in control of that game.
But you know what, though? I actually like that. I want to see what you do when your offense isn't its normal clicking self. Like, that actually showed me something, guys. That actually showed me that Indiana can win ugly. And I think there's merit to that. I mean, I know that a lot of it. Now, Trevor, to your point, if I'm stacking them up against Texas, that win value, that's a bonus for Texas. If I'm just saying overall, I actually think Indiana kind of showed me their offensive line, which has been great all year, didn't play well. Their offense wasn't clicking like it normally does. But they still were able to go out and do enough to win that game. That actually showed me a little something. You know what I mean? Now, it doesn't show me something to like, oh, I'm going to vault them all the way in the top 5. I'm not saying that, but like,
right.
So, maybe this is a team that they can win in different ways. Right. And that's kind of how I look at that team is I need to see that you can win when you don't have your A game. And Indiana showed me they can play a C+ game and still beat the defending national champs. Now, they're not what they were, but I mean, Michigan's not out there getting just murdered by people every week,
sure.
other than Texas, right? Here's my question though, guys. Vince, I'll start with you. If Texas isn't number 3, who is? Like, that's my thing about, okay, move Texas down, but who's ahead of them? You can put BYU there. You're going to put Penn State there, Indiana there, Notre Dame there.
Exactly. There's a chasm between 2 and 3 right now.
Notre Dame has the best case to be number 3 right now based off wins. But you can't ignore the fact that they lost to a 5-4 MAC team at home in a game where Notre Dame literally trailed for over 3 quarters of that game. You can't ignore that. That's what makes this so hard you're like, dang it, Notre Dame. Why did you do this? Because we'd have you number 3 right now, if not number 2.
Yes,
but you can't ignore that loss, right? Because just resume of who you beat. Name me a team that's got 2 top 20 wins outside of Notre Dame. Oh, I got one. BYU. Actually, Notre Dame beat 15-19. BYU beat 14-17, and they're undefeated. So if you're going to make a case that Texas should be down, then you need to be advocating for BYU to be up. But then you've got a lot of ugly wins from BYU.
Yeah.
But that, to me, is exactly what I just said. That shows me that they can win ugly. And you need to do that. I mean, Bama's first title team, they beat a bad Tennessee team 12-10 and blocked 3 kicks in that game. Remember when Terrence Cody blocked like two field goals and an extra point or something like that in that game? So like you're going to have to win that way sometimes. So that's my question to you guys. We all think that you could make a case for Texas to fall, but my question is going to be, who goes? It's like when teams say, well, they should fire that coach. And my answer is like, all right, cool. Who are you going to replace him with? Well, I don't know. Well, you can't fire a guy till you know who you have an idea of who you're going to replace him with. Otherwise, you're an idiot. So that'd be my question is, who would you guys pound the table for saying that should be at number 3 ahead of Texas?
Go ahead, Vince.
Yeah, nobody. There's nobody I'm pounding the table for. I'm fine. The eye test works for me. Texas is the number 3 team in the country right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no problem with that because I've watched them play. I think they're better than IU, who's undefeated. I do, just by watching them play. And so I think they're better than BYU by watching them play. You know what I mean? BYU struggled with Utah. And I realize it's a rivalry game. It's a big deal. I get that. They struggled, right? And that's and admittedly, that's the first time I've watched BYU play this year, right? And they struggled. And so that's helping me form my opinion. Yeah, obviously.
See, I watched them play SMU. I watched them play Kansas State. Like, right. So, I mean, I get where you're coming from, Vince. If that's the only time you've seen them play, you're going to be like, hold on a second. That's not that good of a football team. And they had like sloppy turnovers.
Oh,
and,
sloppy.
I get where you're coming from. Yeah. My thing with BYU is I've seen them actually play at their best as well.
Do you think they beat Texas?
But that's not how I view rank. I'm okay with Texas being ahead of BYU for the reasons that you talked about. Okay, what I'm saying is I don't think we should just like, okay, they played bad here. And like, I don't think I hate when people say, well, I'm going to rank this team because if they played on a neutral field, they would win. Okay, then put Ohio State 1, Bama 2, Georgia 3, because Georgia would be favored to beat anybody on a neutral field outside of Bama, probably, in Oregon and Ohio State, maybe. So that's why I get annoyed when like people that I know who I respect will use, well, who would win on neutral field? Who'd be favored to win on neutral field? Well, who cares? Because otherwise, Bama should be in the playoff every year. Georgia should be in the playoff every year. Ohio State should be in the playoff every year.
Your question is if Texas doesn't exist, who should be number 3? That's your question.
Or
right?
no. If you're gonna, because what my guy Jeremy said is Texas is overrated. It's too high. Okay, I get where you're coming from. No great wins. My thing is, okay, but then who should be there instead?
Yeah, nobody.
And Jeremy, I'd love to hear from you too, because I don't necessarily disagree that Texas doesn't have a great resume. Vince would have Texas 3 for the reasons that we just said. We're in agreement with Texas as being number 3. My question is, if they're not number 3, who would be? And here's the thing: like, we could all make a case. Well, if Penn State shouldn't be 4, then who should be ahead of them? That's easy for us. Indiana, Tennessee, Notre Dame, Miami, Alabama. You know what I mean? Like, I put all those teams ahead of Penn State right now.
Yes.
All of them.
Yes.
Texas is a little different animal. So that would be kind of my thing. So I am curious what people think is about that one. Is, who would you have there? And the problem with some of these teams, like Texas, is not going to get challenged really until the A&M game. You know what I mean? And
correct.
Penn State's not going to get challenged, at least unless it's an upset the rest of the year. That's the frustrating thing is some of these teams just we don't know who they are because they haven't played anybody. At least with Texas, we're like, look, if they go on the road and beat A&M, they've validated that ranking in their spot in the SEC title game. And then they can go prove it against Tennessee or a rematch against Georgia or a game against Bama. Right? Where Penn State's going to do what? Beat Purdue, Minnesota, and who does Penn State play last game of the year? Vince?
Maryland, I think. Is that right?
Let me go look.
This is off the top of my head.
Yeah, correct. At Purdue, at Minnesota, home against Maryland.
It's not going to happen. I'll tell you what, though. I'm going to be a big Kansas Jayhawks fan the next couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah.
Because they play BYU and they play Colorado.
We've talked about, Trevor, I think you and I talked about this last week. Or Vince, you and I might have talked about it
you and I did.
This game is going to be very interesting.
Row the boat, baby. This is the first time I've
ever rooted for PJ Fleck a day in my life. This will be the
first
time I've ever rooted for PJ Fleck.
I will.
And of course, knowing PJ Fleck, he'll let us all down.
I know.
And he'll get murdered by Penn State 42-0.
Well, look, the first time I've rooted for Michigan in quite some time was last weekend, and they let me down.
Yeah.
So just how it works.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. A couple more super chats here, fellas, before we get out of here. Pete Weber with a super chat. Met Pete Weber this weekend, too, Vince. Looks nothing like Pete Weber. Didn't even have the bowling. I was like, you don't even have a bowling. I didn't say that, really. I was like, dude, he was like clean cut, like hair night. I mean, I was, wow, you look like,
that's
like,
great.
Not what I thought. You look nothing like Pete Weber. It was great meeting so many people this weekend.
That's funny.
But Pete Weber says, given the committee's logic, if Notre Dame lost to A&M instead of NIU, how would they be ranked? Losing our most quality win, but not now without the terrible loss. Honestly, if Notre Dame lost to A&M but beat Northern Illinois, I actually think they'd be ranked lower because they would then have a justification. Well, you haven't beat anybody. You only beat Louisville at home by 7. You didn't beat anybody else any good. Northern Illinois would be 4-5 instead of 5-4.
Yeah.
I said this at the beginning of the year, and it's even more true now. If you could flip those two games, I would much rather have Notre Dame have beaten A&M and lost Northern Illinois than the other way around. Both losses are going to ding Notre Dame.
Yeah.
But give me the better wins.
Yeah. Listen, at this point, I think, yes, right now the NIU loss hurts Notre Dame, but I think in the end, the A&M win will help them more than the NIU loss will hurt them at the end. Right now, it's hurting them. But I think once you get to the end of the season, I think it actually helps.
Because here's the deal, to your point, Vince. If your only loss is to an SEC team on the road, then all of a sudden, Bama, Georgia, Ole Miss, all get that little, well, yeah, you played an SEC team and got beat. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
Notre Dame will not get the benefit of but they lost a close game. Wouldn't matter. Your best wins over Louisville. Who cares? 3-loss Louisville team. Give me the better, like if you think they're going to purposely ding Notre Dame, then you want them to have a bad loss as opposed to no good wins. Yeah. That's the reality of it. And to your point, Vince, in the long run, it's going to work out better for Notre Dame that way.
Yep.
Because you're going to finish the season with a 10-game winning streak. You're going to finish the season with dominant wins. You're going to have 2 top 20 wins when it's all said and done, at least 2 top 25 wins, unless Louisville has a really bad upset. Even if they lose to Kentucky, they'll still be in the top 25. A&M, if they lose to Texas, will still be in the top 25. That to me is still going to – because now it's like, okay, by the end of the year, and I think that's what we're seeing a little bit from the committee is being ahead of Miami and ahead of Alabama and ahead of Ole Miss and Georgia is that's my first bit of evidence that they're starting to look past the Northern Illinois loss. You can't completely ignore it. That's why Notre Dame's 8, not 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, because they did lose that game. But I think, Trevor, to what you and I's big concern was this afternoon when we talked is this is the first evidence we've seen that they're starting to look a little bit past that loss because of where they put Miami. Because Miami's best loss is way better than Notre Dame's loss, but Notre Dame's ahead of Miami. Why?
Yeah.
Because Notre Dame has better wins.
Yeah, I mean, even with the bad Northern Illinois loss, Notre Dame is realistically, 1 to 2 spots away from where we project them to be at the end of the season anyways, right? So I agree with you 100% that the Northern Illinois loss is now starting to be more and more farther back in the rearview mirror, I guess you could say, especially because Notre Dame is continuing to win in such emphatic fashion as they are. I think it's more of a story as, what Notre Dame has done post Northern Illinois than just, they're winning. It's like, well, yeah, they're kicking the daylights out of folks, right? Like it's not like they're going through and winning every game 19-12 and, they're not beating opponents like how Penn State beats opponents. I mean, honestly, like not to take another side jab at Penn State, but like I kind of am. That is how their quality of wins look. Notre Dame is beating opponents by 30, by 40, so I think that on top of that big win in week 1 at Kyle Field is also huge. So no, I'm with you. If I could go back in time, I'd keep it the exact same. I really would.
Last one, guys. This is from Walk On Carryoff. Per the SEC number 4 tiebreaker rule, if LSU wins out, they would be in, according to Greg McElroy. If LSU loses, would a 4-loss runner-up be in? No. No. What he's saying is, Vince, is what you discussed earlier about the committee's not going to punish a team for being in the conference title game. But also to your point, LSU, let's say LSU loses, and one of A&M or Texas lose, which has to happen. What he's saying is that if it gets down to, because like a lot of things have to happen. It's not just Tennessee loses and Texas loses. It's also about, okay, how do other common opponents fare these next 3 weeks, right? That's going to factor into it. But if it came down to number 4, what he's saying is LSU would be in. But here's the thing. LSU's not going to climb into the top 12 over the next 3 weeks because they play Florida on the road, Vanderbilt at home, and Oklahoma at home. Vince's point is if you're ranked in the top 12 and you lose competitively, they're not going to punish you most likely and knock you out. That's what Vince had said. They're not going to take a team that's ranked 17th and jump them in because they lost.
Just because they're in the conference title game. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that would be the difference from what Vince was talking about. Is it was more of, and you did say that caveat, Vince, I heard you say it, is if they're already in that top 12 range, they're not going to hurt them.
But it could affect seeding.
Unless it's a blowout. Right.
It could affect seeding. Right.
If you're 11 and you get smacked by 10 or more, you might drop out. You might drop out if it's close. But if let's say somehow Tennessee loses to Georgia, but Tennessee gets in, they're ranked 11th, and they play a great 4-quarter game against Texas and lose by a field goal at the end, I could see a scenario where they say, you know what, we're leaving Tennessee in. They earned it. They played in the SEC title game. We already had them in the top 12 based on what they did in the regular season. And going toe-to-toe with a team that's going to be our number 2 seed for 4 quarters is not going to be something we're going to knock you out for Georgia or something like that. You know what I mean? Like that, because at that point in time, Tennessee would have Georgia would have beaten Tennessee. That, I guess, it could get interesting at that point in time. But point is, I highly doubt it gets down to tiebreaker number 4. I mean, it would just everything would have to go absolutely perfect for that to happen, in my opinion. So it's going to be interesting. It'd be very interesting, fellas, to see how this is all going to play out. I'll have a projection out tomorrow that's going to talk about how I see things going. I will project Texas to win the SEC. I think it's going to kind of take care of itself a little bit. I think Texas is going to handle business, and we won't, because if they beat A&M on the road, and then we're not going to be worried about their seeding. I don't see any huge upsets right now. I don't see like Ohio State getting beat by Indiana. I don't see Ohio State getting beat by Michigan. I think they're going to destroy Michigan this year. I do. I think you remember a couple years ago when Ryan Day was running his mouth, we're going to beat them by 100.
That might happen.
Like they might.
They might.
They might do that this year. I really believe that. But that's kind of how I see it. I hope A&M wins, because that'd be great for Notre Dame. I hope A&M wins out. I'll be rooting for them to win out, but we'll see. I hope that happens. But a lot of football left to be played, guys. And what's, Vince, I've given you credit for this. I got to say this. Tonight reminds me of when they first announced the 12-team playoff. You and I did a show, and I was against it. I think I might even gone on a rant, an anti-12-team playoff rant. And Vince, in his normal self, calm, collected self, made a counter argument about why the 12-team playoff was good. And I was like, dude, that makes a ton of sense. And I was like, okay, I buy it, but we'll see. Right now, this season has played out perfectly for all the advocates for a bigger playoff.
Yeah,
because there's so many teams now in this conversation. And as Notre Dame fans, we have to be excited about a 12-team playoff. Because think about this, fellas. If it wasn't for the 12-team playoff, Notre Dame's season would have been over the first Saturday of September. They would have needed so many upsets to happen in these final 3 weeks to get into the top 4. So many that it would have been almost impossible to get in. It would have been very hard for them to get in. They would need a ton of upsets these next 3 weeks. Now we're talking about it differently. We're talking about Bama. We're talking about SMU. We're talking about who's going to win this game between Tulane and Navy could have an impact on Notre Dame's ranking. And I mean, I thought it was going to cheapen the regular season, and it really hasn't.
No,
it has enhanced the regular season.
Yeah.
Now, if there's a bunch of years down the road where we're arguing about which 3-loss team should be the 8th home seed, then that's going to cheapen the regular season.
Absolutely.
But right now, we're still talking about a lot of 0 and 1-loss teams, and in the SEC with a bunch of 2-loss teams, because the SEC did something the Big Ten did not, which is they scheduled tough their first year. The Big Ten said, we're going to give our best teams crap schedules.
Yeah.
Except Ohio State, because they had to go to Oregon and to Penn State. But Penn State got a cake schedule. Oregon got a cake schedule. Michigan got actually a pretty easy schedule as well. I mean, they got Oregon at home, and they didn't have to play Penn State. They didn't have, they got USC at home.
Texas at home.
Yeah. Well, that was non-conference, but yeah, you're correct. They had all their, except for the Washington game, who was going to be down, all their toughest games were at home until the last game of the year. So, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting, guys, to see how this plays out. But there's going to be a lot of football. We're going to find out a lot. I mean, we talk about do we know how good Texas is? Well, we're going to find out in 3 weeks. Because if they go down to College Station and beat A&M, that's okay. It's like, see, right now with Texas, guys, I make the same argument that I make about Notre Dame. I'm not going to punish them because they had one bad day, which is what the Georgia game was. Let's be real. If Texas and Georgia played a week later, I think that game's way different. I think the thing that hurt Texas was that some of the teams they played were down. Michigan being down hurt Texas because they had not played anything close to what Georgia was going to bring to the table size and speed-wise. Nothing close. And I think it overwhelmed them. Now they've played Vanderbilt, they've played Georgia, they've played A&M. If they played a rematch against Georgia in the SEC title game, I think Texas would smack them because I think they would be much more battle-tested at that point in time. That's how I look at it. But it has added so much value to the regular season. I can't wait for these final 3 games. And for Notre Dame, you got to go out and handle business.
Absolutely.
Got to go handle business.
Yeah, because somebody said something about, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole here, but somebody said something about, bid stealers and all that kind of stuff. And look, right now, Notre Dame has to do what they need to do to get up to a point where bid stealers don't knock them out. Like, that's what you got to do. I mean, and I think they will. And so I won't be as nervous on conference championship weekend of that being the case. But yeah, I mean, that's the risk that you run, obviously. And so you've got to take care of your business. so that those bid stealers aren't affecting what your future looks like. So,
Yeah.
and
Well,
frankly,
and
as a Notre Dame fan,
away
you're
from that, Vince. They're not far
absolutely.
away.
That's what I'm
that.
saying, and that's what I'm saying. They're
Right.
Look, I'm going to circle all the way back to the beginning of the show. I think Notre Dame's is perfectly positioned to get where they need to be. That's how I feel.
If they handle business.
If of course, and that's the
that's where you want to be, though. Is my point.
Yes, absolutely.
You're not completely in control of your own destiny, but this is the most control of
Pretty darn close
they've been in since the Northern Illinois loss. Honestly,
Yep.
Because if Indiana goes out and gets whipped by Ohio State, and if Georgia beats Tennessee, I don't see any scenario which Notre Dame falls behind any of those teams if they handle their business.
Correct.
Because Bama has zero chances to play in a top 25 game between now and the end of the season.
Right.
Unless somehow they sneak into the SEC title game.
But
that would require a bunch of other teams to lose, right?
Notre Dame, 2 teams are falling off that are in front of them right now. That's why I see it.
Tennessee has a shot to play a top 25 team. I don't think BYU will have one until the Big 12 title game, but it won't matter if they win out. It won't matter.
They're going to be up top anyway.
Yeah. But if BYU loses in the Big 12 title game, they're not going to get an at-large ahead of Notre Dame. They may still get in, but I'm saying, I'm just from Notre Dame, but they won't be ahead of Notre Dame. Right. To a degree, you almost – I mean, some of those things, like the Big 12 at this point in time, almost doesn't matter to Notre Dame. Like what happens in the Big 12 is irrelevant to Notre Dame the rest of the way. Because if BYU wins out, they're going to be ahead of Notre Dame anyway, and it doesn't matter. If BYU loses the Big 12 title game and K-State gets in, doesn't matter. Whoever that team in the Big 12 is going to be in because there's only going to be one Big 12 team. Any of those leagues where there's only going to be one team in it doesn't steal anything from Notre Dame.
Yep.
Right? Like that's the whole point is there are no bid stealers in position to do anything to Notre Dame because if somebody steals BYU's bid, BYU's falling behind Notre Dame, guys. They just will. If somebody comes in and steals the ACC bid, it doesn't matter. There's 0 ACC teams ahead of Notre Dame right now.
Yep.
It doesn't matter.
That'll be the only
which
one
means one is going to be in, but there's nobody like BYU could argue, let's say they lost and they keep BYU in and they fall to 8, Notre Dame's at 9, but that's not going to happen, in my opinion. It's highly unlikely that's going to happen. If some team that is behind Notre Dame right now wins the SEC, it means 2 teams ahead of Notre Dame right now lose another game.
Right.
If Ohio State loses another game to Indiana, let's say, okay, well, one of Ohio State then falls behind Notre Dame, guys. That's
Correct.
just I would
2 losses.
They'd have 2 losses, and then they only have like 1 good win in Notre Dame. You know what I mean? So it's like But even if it doesn't, if Indiana flips with Ohio State, it still doesn't affect Notre Dame because they're both ahead of Notre Dame anyway.
Right.
And then the Big Ten champs already in there. So like, there's no scenario right now, in my opinion, barring Notre Dame not playing well and getting leaped by somebody, where a bid stealer can impact Notre Dame. Not now, to your point, Vince, not now at 8, because they're ahead of, like if they were at 8 and Miami was ahead of them and then Miami lost to SMU by a field goal late in the game, you could argue maybe Miami deserves to stay ahead of Notre Dame, but Miami's behind Notre Dame now. And they don't play anybody the next 3 games to potentially leap back ahead of Notre Dame, where Notre Dame plays a top 25 team between now and then. So that's where I think Vince nailed it. This is why Notre Dame isn't. They are in as good of a position to control their own destiny as they've been since that loss in Northern Illinois.
Yep.
That means going out not only winning but continue to look good doing it.
Correct. Yep.
And with Army being ranked, you now don't have to beat them by 40. You just have to beat them convincingly. 2 touchdowns. It's like, hey, away from home, neutral field, top 25 team, you beat them by 2 touchdowns. Stay or go up. That's what they'll do. You know what I mean? So it's a great place to be, guys. Great place to be. So that's where we're at, Vince, for this week. We'll be back next week, guys. A lot going on. Trevor, you and I will be back tomorrow, 1 o'clock. Going to do a little bit more Virginia Notre Dame preview. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll dive into a lot of Bice a Hole tomorrow. Thursday, do keys to victory and predictions. Friday, mailbag. And then Saturday postgame show. Vince, are you going to be on the postgame show this week? You guys got any visits this weekend?
Nope. I'm here. I'm here. Visits are over until the OVs. OVs only at this point.
Let's do it. All right, Vince, why don't you go and take us out of here, man? Great show, guys. Right. Very well done by the 2 of you. Thank you.
Hey, guys, thanks everybody for hanging out with us, joining us, and a little bit IB After Dark on Tuesday evenings. We'll be back next Tuesday for sure. So make sure you check it out. Anytime there's going to be a college football ranking, we will have a show depending on what, not depending on what time, but after or during whenever they have the show. And so that will vary week to week based on basketball and everything else. But we will always come to you with some sort of a breakdown. So make sure you stick it out and hit that notification bell so that you know when we are going to be on. But in the meantime, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, that notification bell, share with your family and friends. Give us a 5-star review. And, of course, jump on the boards.irishbreakdown.com for all your Notre Dame Fighting Irish intel needs. It's all right there. Best bang for your buck out there. So for Bryan, for Trevor, I'm Vince, and we will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast. Have a great night.